Joining us now from Busan in South Korea is Associate Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Busan National University. Professor, what would you say is fueling this drive towards closer ties between Japan and South Korea? Concerns for, say, regional security or the economic fruits of diplomacy?
I think it's probably regional security. I think the Americans are probably behind the scenes, doing a lot of arm twisting. It's very much in the Americans' interest to get Korea and Japan working together on China, particularly now that the issue of the South China Sea has come up. The Korea-Japan issues are pretty deep. They run pretty far back. But there's a lot of interest among elites everywhere in Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo that they find a way to work together to deal with the larger regional issues that are pressing North Korea and China particularly. And the Americans have traditionally in the past kind of tried to knock heads together and get these two to sit at a table. That's my guess this time as well.
Now, Professor, you alluded to the very emotive issues at stake and at play. Now, polls conducted in both countries show that over 50% of those surveyed say that their image of the other side has worsened. What does this mean, and how does it make a difference?
Yeah, the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years have actually been some of the worst since Korea and Japan normalized their relationship 50 years ago. That's what today is the anniversary of. A lot of this at the moment, I think, is a leadership issue. Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, is widely distrusted in South Korea. Park Geun-hye, the president of South Korea, her father actually helped collaborate with the Japanese when they controlled Korea, so she is to a certain extent politically in a bind here. She can't look like she reaches out too much to the Japanese because she's got her own sort of political past here. But a lot of these issues, really go back to the way the Japanese teach and talk about what they did in Korea. Very often in Japan, the Japanese colonialism here is sort of soft-pedaled, and there's sort of suggestions of, well, maybe it wasn't so bad, and sort of Korea benefited from Japanese colonization and things like that. And the Koreans vociferously deny that, and that's really where it's sort of stuck. I mean, there's a real issue about how Japan thinks about what it did here, and that's what the Koreans want to see. That's what people keep waiting and waiting and waiting for.
Professor, I'm almost afraid to ask this question, but, Tokyo and Seoul still clash over these various historical issues.
Right.
Do you see any way that any of these issues could effectively be resolved?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, I think so. The first step has to be that Japanese conservatives particularly need to realize that the war is widely seen outside of Japan as imperialism, not just in South Korea, but in China and the United States and Southeast Asia. And there has to be some movement on the Japanese side that suggests that the Japanese are prepared to admit things like the barbarities and the brutalities, things like the comfort women and stuff like that. That's not to say that China and South Korea couldn't do a lot. Also, I do think that Chinese and the South Koreans politicize history for their own purposes, particularly for domestic purposes and for re-election purposes, right? But now what you've got is sort of 70 years of sort of bad blood, and the bad blood feeds in itself. It's become sort of a self-perpetuating process, right? In the particular case of Korea and Japan, I think, quite honestly, not much will happen as long as Park and Abe are in the leadership positions. They're both just too vested in separate sides on this. I think you need new leadership on both sides, particularly Japan's side, but new leadership on both sides would help a great deal.
Professor Kelly, thank you very much for your insights. We've been speaking to Associate Professor Robert Kelly, speaking to us from Busan in South Korea.